You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're listening to Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. And remember, Locked On Mets is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube at Locked On Mets. This episode is brought to you by Spotify Green Room. Download the app and join me later tonight on Wednesday to get in on the action. Spotify Green Room, changing the way we talk sports. Now, on today's show, we are going to continue my series of the top 10 most disappointing aspects to the 2021 season. And today we are focusing on the evaporating pitching depth. Although in the first segment today, I will touch on the doubleheader the Mets played against the Marlins. I want to talk about Marcus Stroman's performance and Noah Syndergaard getting back on the mound. So we'll do that in the first segment. Then in the second segment, I want to talk about David Peterson and Joey Lucchesi and how they got hurt at really bad times this year, and also their struggles early on, how it shaped that first part of the Mets season. Then in the last segment, we'll talk about the rest of the pitching depth that evaporated. We're not talking about Carlos Carrasco or Jacob deGrom. We're talking about that depth that the Mets were talking about going into the season, how they had 9 viable starters heading into spring training, and where all that went, and what the Mets can do next year to change that. And that's what we'll discuss again at the end of the show. Before we get to any of that, though, I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on Twitter at FinkelsteinRyan. You could also follow the show at Locked On Mets. So beginning with Marcus Stroman, he pitched game 1 of a meaningless doubleheader against the Marlins. And when Stroman stole second base, that to me was the epitome of a meaningless game in September. It's not a knock on Stro. Glad he did it. Great little moment there where he stole second, throw goes past, he gets to third base. Stroman has just been a highlight reel all year long, but that's not happening. The Mets are still in the mix here. I don't know if he has the gall to steal a base. And he kind of went into this last start of the season trying to embrace it and have fun. And it was a great start to watch. It goes 5 innings, allows just 2 runs, gets his 10th win of the season. If you remember going into opening day, I made a pretty bold proclamation that Marcus Stroman would lead this team in wins, and this was at a time where Jacob deGrom was still healthy. My theory for why he would lead the team in wins is because I felt like the Mets played great behind him. I thought he would have a monster season, and he really did that. He was the most dependable part of this Mets team. Most starts by a Mets pitcher, and this is in franchise history, where they've allowed no more than 2 earned runs in a season. Marcus Stroman now had 24 this year, which puts him behind only 3 pitchers in Mets history: Tom Seaver, Doc Gooden, and Jacob deGrom. Seaver had 28 in 71 and 73. Gooden had 28 in 1985. deGrom had 26 in 2018 and 25 in 2019, his 2 Cy Young seasons. Stroman has not been that level of dominant. He has not gone as deep into games as those 3 starters did in their campaigns where they had all of those starts with 2 earned runs or less, but it still shows how dependable he has been. And Marcus Stroman talked about his free agency. He's excited about it, excited about the opportunity to find a home where he knows he's going to be there for multiple years. And it sounds like he's very open to that being with the Mets. He also talked about wanting to play with Javi Baez for the rest of his career. So I think Stroman's going to be very open to staying with the Mets long term. He's just going to have to get paid. And I think that's where the conversation comes in this offseason. How much are you willing to pay Marcus Stroman? And I think that is certainly something we'll be discussing a lot this offseason. But when it comes to the 2021 season, Marcus Stroman did all you could have asked for. I mean, he did. He was the one constant in a rotation that was anything but that when it comes to the injuries. And that's what we're going to be talking about a lot on today's show, the evaporating pitching depth. And a big part of that was Noah Syndergaard. We thought we'd get a full second half of Noah Syndergaard. Not the case. Not the case at all. Noah Syndergaard had setback after setback. Ultimately, in the last week of the season, he gets back on the mound at Citi Field. Great to see. Starts game 2 of the doubleheader Good for the fans, good for Syndergaard to go out there. He strikes out 2 batters with some 96-mile-per-hour heat, looking like his old self a little bit. But that was it. He pitched an inning. That's all I would expect you're going to see a Syndergaard this year. I don't know why they would rush him back to have another, rehab-like appearance against the Braves. It doesn't seem like there's a point to that. But he wanted to come back. It's almost like when David Wright made that return his last year where he played the one game and he actually had a credit to his name in 2018. It's very similar to that. Noah Syndergaard will have something on his baseball reference page for 2021, 1 inning, 2 strikeouts, no earned runs. So that is all fine and well, but I don't expect him on the mound again. And the Mets also shut down Jacob deGrom as well because there's no point in him pitching in what is now a meaningless season. So that is your update on the current Mets team. Again, we're kind of moving beyond that this week, talking about the biggest disappointments of the season. And going into the year, the Mets starting rotation as you entered spring training, it was supposed to be Jacob deGrom, Carlos Carrasco, Marcus Stroman, and Taijuan Walker, with Noah Syndergaard on the way later on in the year. Now, they also had this great depth, and that's what we're going to talk about on today's show. You had David Peterson, Joey Lucchesi, and Jordan Yamamoto all vying for spots at that last part of the Mets rotation until Syndergaard came back. All of them dealt with injuries. There's more guys to discuss, but we'll start with those 3 in just a minute. This episode is brought to you by Spotify Green Room. Green Room is the first social audio platform made for sports fans. The app is free to download, and once you're in, you talk with me, other fans, athletes, and insiders in real time about your favorite team or sport. I will be hosting a Spotify Green Room later tonight where you can finally join in on the conversation you listen to here every day. All you have to do is download the free Green Room app now, which is currently available on all devices. Be sure to create a profile, link your Twitter, join the MLB group for the latest league updates, and follow me at Finkelstein Ryan to be notified when my room goes live. I know you won't want to miss it. Again, I'm planning to be live later tonight. I can't wait to hear everyone's thoughts on the Mets. I'll see you there. Spotify Green Room, changing the way we talk sports. All eyes are on the gridiron as teams are back for the start of another football season. And as always, BetOnline is your number one spot for all the pro and college football action this season. With the new updated site and interface, there's now even more odds, props, and contests available at betonline.ag, which continues to be the number one source for everything football. Head to the website or use your mobile device to sign up today and receive your 100% welcome bonus with the promo code NFL100. That's double your initial deposit just for signing up. From football, basketball, baseball to boxing, right to your favorite Vegas casino games, don't wait to take advantage of all the amazing offers available for the 2021 season. BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to bet on all of your favorite sports. BetOnline, your online sportsbook experts. So as I said, at the start of the year, you had David Peterson, Joey Lucchesi, and Jordan Yamamoto all vying for that last spot in the rotation. And then Carlos Carrasco went down, and there was 2 spots available, and Peterson and Lucchesi ended up getting them. The Mets had a couple of lefties in their rotation. Peterson, you had high hopes for, pitched to a 3.44 ERA in 2020. You thought you'd get more of that. By the end of the year, he ended up with a 5.54 ERA. But early on, it looked even worse. Through his first 11 starts, Peterson pitched to a 6.32 ERA. He dealt with some more control issues. He really struggled to keep the ball in the yard. He was getting knocked around and knocked out of starts early. He would have the rare gem mixed in between the bad starts that would bring that ERA down a bit and it would make you a believer. And then he'd have 2 bad starts. That was really his season early on, but he began to turn a corner on June 14th. Pitched 6 scoreless against the Chicago Cubs. Then he allows just 1 run in a start against the Nats where he struck out 6, did walk 3, and was pulled with 2 outs in the 5th inning. But there was progress. Then he goes out against the Phillies, 6 strong innings, allows just 1 run. So we thought David Peterson had turned a corner. At the time, Joey Lucchesi was experiencing a similar big spark to the end of his, what ended up being the end of his season, but in the middle of the season where he had found himself, and we were praising Jeremy Hefner for the great work he did with these guys. Then Peterson allows 6 runs to the Braves. He's pulled after 3 innings, and then we find out he has a strained oblique. So that was David Peterson's season. And if you thought the oblique ended his year, that's not what happened. That would be way too normal for an oblique strain to be the end of his season. Because for the Mets, it has to be a little bit extra, a little bit special, a little bit of misery added on, a little bit of irony. And so David Peterson went on the season-ending IL when he broke his foot just walking around. Just walking around, ends up breaking his foot. And so he had to have surgery to fix what was going on in his foot while he was recovering from an oblique strain. So that is just the exact epitome of what we're talking about today, evaporating pitching depth. And Joey Lucchesi, another example of that, had a terrible start to the year, 9.19 ERA through his first 6 appearances. Then Jeremy Hefner gets him in the lab. They drop that arm angle down a little more 3/4. All of a sudden, he pitches to a 1.19 ERA over his final 5 starts, 24 strikeouts and 22 2/3 innings pitched. He starts to go deeper into games. If you remember, Lucchesi, start of the year, sometimes he would have an opener. Sometimes he would essentially become an opener because he wouldn't go deep enough. He was only giving the Mets 3 or 4 innings. Then he finds it, and they start trusting him. Gets to the point where Lucchesi was throwing 5+ innings right when he gets hurt. And if you don't remember Lucchesi's injury, he had to get Tommy John surgery. So Lucchesi not only out for the remainder of this year, this was all the way back in the middle of the season, but he's also likely out for next year as well. A definite non-tender candidate. The Mets, if they want to, can tender him a contract, let him continue to rehab as part of the team. Maybe he makes it back at the end of next year, but you would still have control of him for that following season. It might be a worthwhile investment. We'll see what the Mets decide to do with Lucchesi. He certainly showed something at the end of his season, but I don't know if it's going to be enough where the Mets are going to decide to keep him around when they know that he's not going to be a big impact pitcher next season. A guy that could be, though, is Jordan Yamamoto, and he's been on the IL pretty much all year. Shoulder injury is what landed him there. Wasn't great when he did make a few appearances with the Mets, but still, that represented some of your best depth, and you lost it. And so when you continue to lose all these guys, you're left with the Jared Eichhoffs of the world. And as we all know, the Jared Eichhoff experience was certainly one that we may never forget. And that's one that we'll talk about in just a minute. Some of the other guys that went down this year, some of the other sad cases of evaporating pitching depth. And we'll also talk about what the Mets can do next year to improve that depth and not go through similar struggles next season. Built Bar is the best tasting protein bar ever. There are so many delicious flavors to choose from, whether it's the coconut bar, cherry barcia, raspberry, mint brownie, double chocolate, salted caramel, strawberry, orange, German chocolate, my personal favorite, cookies and cream. And they keep on coming out new flavors like the grasshopper cookie, which is a mint flavor, very good as well. If you haven't tried all the flavors, you can get a mixed box where you'll get 2 of each and you can see which ones you like best. These really are protein bars that taste like candy bars. They come covered in 100% chocolate. They're soft, they're easy to chew, and they're healthy. Built Bars come low in calories, low in sugar, but they're high in protein and high in fiber. If you want to try Built Bar today, go to BuiltBar.com. Use the promo code LOCK15. You'll get 15% off your next order. Again, that's promo code LOCK15 for 15% off at BuiltBar.com. So I don't know if you longtime Locked On Mets listeners will remember this, but at the start of the season, I did a podcast with Jack Ramsey, and we discussed how the Mets Syracuse rotation stacked up against some of the worst rotations in baseball, based on the hypothesis that the Mets had so much pitching depth that they had a rotation that was worthy of being in the major leagues for like a 5th place team. That was the whole impetus of the podcast. We did 2 parts on it. If you want to go back and laugh, you can, because we were very high on some of these guys like a Jared Eichhoff that we thought, hey, he's not great, but he's a major league 5th starter. And that didn't work out for the Mets. Now Eichhoff, at one point I promised I would stop ripping the guy because I was really hard on him in the middle of that season there, especially when he gave up 10 runs against the Braves. He earned it, but he also was a good sport to keep coming back, keep taking the ball from the Mets. He felt an ownership of being part of the team, and he certainly was a professional the whole way through. So it is wrong to rip the guy, but the results are the results. He had an 8.69 ERA. He was not good. And you look at the other depth options the Mets had this year, and again, that depth just evaporated so quickly. Mike Montgomery was a great pitcher for the Mets in spring training. Seemed like he was angling towards getting a job on the team. And then ultimately, I don't know if they were deciding to go in another direction or it was just him, but he opts out of his contract, ends up going to the KBO, pitching out in Korea. So that was one of the Mets' arms they lost very early. Corey Oswalt was hurt all year. I'm a fan of Oswalt. I don't think he is this elite pitcher, but as your seventh starter going into a season, I think he's fine to get some innings for you, to make some spot starts. And he only pitched 7 innings overall this year, minors and majors. So he had a really bad injury-plagued year. You have Thomas Szapucki, who comes up, makes his debut. This is a top prospect. At the time, the Mets' top pitching prospect. And he was having a pretty decent year, but he was totally rushed up to the show due to injuries, due to necessity. And it was just a bad look for the Mets. He looked terrified when he came into that game against the Braves. Really struggled, and then ends up getting hurt and had to undergo season-ending ulnar nerve transposition surgery. For a guy who has not pitched a ton in his minor league career but has a lot of potential, that's not an injury you want to see, a nerve issue in that pitching arm. So hopefully he irons that out and can find some way to be successful. But the time he comes back next year, I would not be surprised if the Mets gave up on the hopes of him being a starting pitcher, and maybe they try to focus on turning him into a lefty reliever that can have some promise that way, because the injuries have just been mounting every single year for the poor guy. And I think my voice just cracked there a little bit. So yeah, I'm really broken up about it. So yeah, Szapucki was just another one of the pitchers the Mets had that was unable to stay on the mound. Sean Reed-Foley was great for the Mets in the beginning, then he wasn't. It ironically came during a time where they were cutting down on sticky substances in baseball. Don't know if that was anything that correlated, but there was a certain regression that we saw when it comes to Sean Reed-Foley. And then he got hurt and was pretty much done for the year. Then we have my favorite pitcher to talk about when it comes to evaporating pitching depth, Sam McWilliams. There was a Sports Illustrated cover of Sam McWilliams with a big, bold headline behind him that said, "Why?" And the point of the article is, why did the Mets just give a major league contract to a guy who had an ERA over 8 in AAA last year? And at the time, I and many others were praising the move because this was a guy that people were really confident in his stuff. He's a huge guy, very tall, 6'7", if I'm not mistaken, has a big fastball, had a slider that had some promise, and people thought he had the potential to maybe start, but if anything, be a weapon out of a bullpen. The Mets give him a major league contract. He did have options, so we knew he would start the year in the minor leagues when he didn't, break through out of camp. And there was a lot of eyes on him that he could be a big part of this team, and he was terrible. Had a really rough year, ERA over 10 with the Mets. I didn't even make it to 10 appearances. I think he had 7 appearances before they ultimately DFA'd him in June to clear up a spot in the 40. So Sam McWilliams was a failed experiment at adding pitching depth this offseason. And I don't really blame the front office for the pitching depth not panning out. A lot of injuries to a lot of guys. Really, what we did learn this year, though, is the best depth is frontline depth. I think that is what was clear to me. You can't go into a season with 5 good starting pitchers and 5 mediocre starting pitchers behind them and think that's going to get you through a season. Really, you want to have 5 good to great starters that you're going to build your rotation around, and then 2 or 3 guys who are good, and you're just going to have to try to figure out what to do with them. I would say Jordan Yamamoto next year could potentially fall into the back end of that class. But what I'm talking about is going into next season with Tyler McGill and David Peterson being your pitching depth that might start the year in Syracuse, because you know what? Sorry, guys, we don't got a spot for you. That's what you want to build this offseason, because when your guys go down, now there is the real opportunity for someone like Tyler McGill, who did it this year, to step in and be that guy. But then again, Tyler McGill throughout the entirety of the season was not able to hold up. I do think part of that was all the innings that he pitched, a big jump for him. So I still have faith in McGill to be a quality starting pitcher, but I don't think he's earned that 5th spot in the rotation like we thought he might have at one point in the season. And I think David Peterson is a good test case on why he shouldn't have earned that spot, because David Peterson was very good in a short year in 2020. Thought for sure he'd be locked into the Mets rotation for the next 5 years, right? Cost control, a young starting pitcher, and he had his struggles. So no one is promised a spot in the rotation. And the best teams have guys like Julio Urias in LA who spend years in bullpens trying to crack a rotation until they finally get a spot. There's no problem with that. So I think what we've learned this year when it comes to building pitching depth is you need to not only have 5 starters that you trust, you need to have 7 that you trust. And outside of that, the depth you add beyond that, you got to hope that there's some high upside pieces there because the Jared Icotts of the world just aren't going to get you through a 162 game season if they become your 5th starter. It's not a way to go out and win a division. And so I think when we get to these conversations about Marcus Stroman and Noah Syndergaard, the 2 guys we talked about in the first segment who pitched today, that is the argument for keeping both of them because you need as much frontline depth as possible. So you go into next year and you might have $100 million rotation, but you know what? If next season you go into spring training and Tyler McGill and David Peterson have almost no shot at making the roster, you did your job this offseason. And a rotation of Jacob deGrom with Marcus Stroman, Carlos Carrasco, Noah Syndergaard, and Taijuan Walker, that's what I'd like to see next year, unless the Mets decide to go outside of the organization and sign a different free agent. But I think, as we discussed last week talking about Stroman, I think he's still the free agent that makes a lot of sense. I think he can fall into the Mets price range. And I also think that Noah Syndergaard has a pretty good chance of coming back on the qualifying offer. So if all that happens, the Mets will be in great shape. But for this season, one of the things that probably didn't get talked about enough was just how snake bitten the Mets were when it came to their rotation with injuries. It was just unprecedented to see guy after guy get injured. And even when they're rehabbing an oblique, they might break their foot, as was the case with David Peterson. That's going to be all for today's edition of Locked On Mets. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. Make sure you follow me on Twitter at Finkelstein Ryan. Follow the show at Locked On Mets. And thanks again for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. We'll be back tomorrow with another edition of this series of top 10 most disappointing aspects of the 2021 season. And we'll be talking about Dominic Smith and JD Davis. Now for your second listen today, make sure you check out the Locked On Bets podcast, where betting does not need to be a guessing game anymore. Hosted by your boy Q and handicapping expert Lee Sterling. Get daily picks, blowout specials, wrong team favorite picks, and Lee Sterling's lock of the day by following the Locked On Bets podcast, brought to you by BetOnline.ag, wherever you get podcasts.